Snowflakes the size of silver dollars fell sideways across the rugged Colorado plains, burying secrets and freezing blood before it could even spill onto the hardened earth. Out on the desolate edge of nowhere, an isolated, weather-beaten cabin stood stubbornly against the howling wind. Inside, a desperate young woman with a meager handful of firewood prepared to face the frozen wrath of 1878 entirely alone. But fate had a different, far more dangerous plan. Before midnight, her splintered door would rattle under the heavy, frantic fists of a terrifying mountain man, bringing a storm of violence, deceit, and an earth-shattering revelation that would alter her life forever. Cora Miller possessed the kind of quiet, calloused resilience that was entirely native to the unforgiving frontier. At 21 years old, her hands were already rough from chopping wood and pulling frozen root vegetables from the unyielding dirt. She lived in a solitary, single-room log cabin nestled in the shadow of the San Juan Mountains, a place where the winters did not merely arrive, but rather descended like a physical blow. The year was 1878, and the territory was a lawless expanse of broken dreams and abandoned mining claims. Cora's own father, Josiah Miller, had been one of the many casualties of the region's false promises. A cave-in at the notorious Shenandoah Dives mine 2 winters prior had taken his life, leaving Cora with nothing but a heavily mortgaged plot of stony land, a rusty Winchester rifle, and a stubborn refusal to let the frontier break her. The local land baron, a ruthless and wealthy speculator named Harlan Pratt, had been circling her property like a starved buzzard for months. Pratt knew she was behind on the county taxes. He knew she was running out of flour and dried meat. He was simply waiting for the winter to do his dirty work for him. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks on this particular late November evening, the temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. The sky bruised into a dark, violent purple. Cora stood at the chopping block behind her cabin, her breath pluming in thick white clouds as she brought a heavy iron axe down upon a knotty piece of pine. Every strike sent a jolt of pain up her undernourished arms, but she dared not stop. The local trappers, men who passed through the nearby settlement of Silverton, had been warning of a century storm brewing over the northern ridges. Carrying the last armful of split wood inside, Cora quickly barred the heavy oak door. The cabin was a meager sanctuary. The gaps between the logs were stuffed with dried mud and horsehair, yet the bitter drafts still found their way through, whistling a mournful tune. She struck a match, her trembling fingers carefully transferring the flame to the oil lamp on her small wooden table. The warm, flickering light illuminated her pale, drawn face, and the deep exhaustion pooling beneath her brown eyes. She added a few logs to the stone hearth, watching the flames lick the dry bark. Dinner would be a thin bowl of cornmeal mush and a single withered apple, a ration she had to stretch if she was going to survive the week. As she stirred the pot over the fire, the wind outside began to scream, a high-pitched, demonic wail that rattled the iron hinges of her windows. The blizzard had officially struck. Snow piled against the eastern wall with a heavy, muffling weight. For hours, Cora sat wrapped in a frayed woolen quilt, mending a torn stocking and trying to ignore the deep, hollow ache in her stomach. The isolation of the mountains could drive a person mad if they listened to the wind too closely. She recited verses from her father's worn Bible, not out of profound piety, but simply to hear a human voice. It was near midnight when the sound broke through the roaring gale. It was not the rhythmic thud of a falling branch, nor the scratching of a hungry coyote. It was a heavy, deliberate pounding. Thump, thump, thump. Cora froze, her needle slipping and pricking her thumb. A bead of bright red blood welled up. She held her breath, staring at the thick wooden door. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks on her exhausted mind. Thump, thump, thump. Open up! A voice bellowed from the other side, a deep, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the shrieking wind. In the name of God, open the door! Panic seized her chest. A woman alone in the territory did not open her door at midnight to strangers. The mountains were full of outlaws, deserters, and desperate men who would slit a throat for a warm pair of boots. Cora slowly lowered her mending and backed away toward the corner of the room where the Winchester rifle leaned against the wall. She grasped the cold, heavy barrel, checking the chamber with a practiced, albeit shaking, hand. It was loaded. "Go away," Cora shouted, her voice sounding frail and pathetic against the storm. "I have a rifle, and I know how to use it. There's nothing for you here." "Lady, please," the voice roared back, laced with an undeniable edge of desperation. "I ain't here to rob you. I have a dying man out here. He won't last another 10 minutes in this freeze." Cora hesitated. Her father, Josiah, had been a deeply charitable man. He had always said that turning a traveler away in a Colorado blizzard was the same as putting a bullet in their brain. If there truly was a dying man on her porch, her conscience would never survive the guilt of leaving him to the snowdrifts. But if it was a trick, a common ruse used by road agents on the trails between Durango and Silverton, she would be forfeiting her own life. She crept toward the door, keeping the rifle raised to her shoulder. "Step back from the door," she commanded, trying to inject as much venom into her tone as possible. "I'm opening it, but if you make a sudden move, I will drop you where you stand." There was a muffled grunt of acknowledgement from the other side. Cora threw the heavy iron bolt and pulled the latch. The wind violently ripped the door from Cora's grasp, slamming it against the interior wall with a deafening crack. A blinding swirl of white snow and freezing air blasted into the cabin, instantly extinguishing the oil lamp and threatening to put out the hearth fire. Through the roaring whiteout, a massive silhouette stepped over the threshold. Cora gasped, her finger tightening on the trigger of the Winchester. The man was colossal, easily standing 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a barn door. He was draped in heavy, snow-caked grizzly bear furs, making him look less like a human and more like a wild beast emerging from hibernation. A thick, frost-covered beard obscured most of his face, save for a pair of piercing, ice-blue eyes that locked onto the barrel of her rifle without a hint of fear. But it was what the mountain man was carrying that gave Cora pause. Slung over his massive shoulder like a sack of grain was another man. The second figure was slender, wearing a fine woolen coat that was entirely inappropriate for the high country, and he was completely unconscious. His head bobbed lifelessly, his dark hair matted with a terrifying amount of frozen blood. "Shut the door before the fire dies," the giant commanded, his voice rumbling like an impending avalanche. He didn't wait for her permission. He pushed past her, bringing with him the overwhelming scent of pine needles, raw leather, and copper. Cora scrambled to shove the heavy oak door shut against the howling gale, throwing her entire body weight against it until she could slide the iron bolt back into place. The sudden quiet in the cabin was heavy and tense, save for the crackling of the fire and the ragged, shallow breathing of the unconscious man. The mountain man gently lowered his companion onto Cora's only bed, a narrow cot stuffed with corn husks. He did it with a surprising, almost maternal tenderness that sharply contrasted with his terrifying, savage appearance. "I need boiling water, clean rags, and whatever whiskey you have," the man said, turning to face her. He began to strip off his heavy fur coat, revealing broad, muscular shoulders clad in a worn flannel shirt, and a heavy leather gun belt holstering a terrifyingly large Colt revolver. Cora stood frozen near the door, still gripping her rifle. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound brave. "What happened to him?" The mountain man paused, his icy blue eyes sweeping over her. He took in her frayed dress, her defensive posture, and the desperate poverty of the cabin. "My name is Jeremiah Hayes," he said slowly, holding his large hands up to show he meant no harm. "This here is Thomas. We got caught in the whiteout coming down from the ridge. A dead pine snapped in the wind, caught him right in the side of the head and shoulder. If I don't stop the bleeding and get him warm, The frost will take his fingers, and the blood loss will take his life. Cora stared at him.
This story
The
was
name
posted on the
Jeremiah
channel
Hayes
The Rusty
didn't mean
Saddle.
anything to
Please
her,
do not
but
repost
the
it in
bleeding
any
man on
form.
her bed was a reality she couldn't ignore. She slowly lowered the rifle, leaning it against the table, though keeping it within arm's reach. "I don't have whiskey," Cora said, moving toward the hearth. "I have hot water, and I have an old petticoat I can tear for bandages. That's all." Jeremiah nodded, a brief flash of gratitude softening his hardened features. "It'll have to do. I'm obliged to you, Miss Miller," she replied curtly. Cora Miller. For the next hour, the small cabin transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Cora brought a tin basin of steaming water to the bedside. Up close, Jeremiah was even more intimidating. Scars crisscrossed his weathered skin, telling tales of a violent, unforgiving life in the wild. Yet, as he worked to clean the blood from Thomas's face and shoulder, his massive, calloused hands moved with a practiced precision. Cora helped tear the clean cotton cloth into strips. As she handed them to Jeremiah, their hands briefly brushed. His skin was like hot iron, radiating a fierce, vital heat. She quickly pulled away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability. She was miles from the nearest neighbor, trapped in a blizzard with a man who could snap her neck as easily as breaking a dry twig. "He's burning up," Jeremiah muttered, pressing the back of his hand against Thomas's pale forehead. "Fever's setting in quick." Cora looked down at Thomas. Stripped of his ruined coat, his clothing revealed a stark contrast to Jeremiah's rugged attire. Thomas wore a silk waistcoat beneath his outer layers, and fine leather boots that had never seen a day of hard labor in a mine or on a farm. He looked like an aristocrat who had taken a terribly wrong turn. "He doesn't look like a mountain man," Cora observed quietly, handing Jeremiah another wet cloth. Jeremiah didn't look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the wound. "He ain't. He's an Easterner. Had a romantic notion about panning for gold up in the high creeks. Paid me a handsome sum to guide him. Fool didn't know the difference between a flake of pyrite and a grizzly bear track." It was a plausible story. Silverton was full of naive men from New York and Boston looking to strike it rich, only to be swallowed whole by the harsh reality of the Rockies. But as Cora watched Jeremiah work, a subtle unease began to curdle in her stomach. Jeremiah pulled a small leather pouch from his belt and extracted a handful of dried green herbs. He crushed them between his fingers and dropped them into a cup of hot water, creating a pungent, earthy tea. "Yarrow," he explained, noticing Cora's stare. "Stops the bleeding and fights the rot." He lifted Thomas's head and carefully poured the bitter liquid down the unconscious man's throat. Thomas coughed weakly, thrashing his head from side to side. "Hold him steady, Cora," Jeremiah instructed, dropping the formalities. Cora leaned over the bed, pressing her hands against Thomas's uninjured shoulder to keep him still, while Jeremiah bound the wound tightly with the torn cotton strips. The physical exertion left them both breathing heavily in the quiet cabin. When the task was finally done, Jeremiah stood up, towering over her once more. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the rescue seemingly draining from his massive frame. "You saved his life by opening that door, Miss Miller? I won't forget it." Cora nodded, retreating to the safety of the hearth. She dished out a bowl of the meager cornmeal mush and offered it to him. "It's not much, but it's hot." Jeremiah took the bowl, his large hands dwarfing the tin dish. He ate in silence, staring into the flames. The sheer physical presence of the man commanded the room. He was a force of nature, much like the storm raging outside. As Cora covertly watched him, she realized that letting the mountain man into her home was a gamble she had already taken. Now, she just had to survive the night with the hand she had been dealt. The storm did not abate. If anything, by the early hours of the morning, the blizzard had intensified, burying the small cabin under several feet of snow. The windows were entirely blocked by white drifts, plunging the room into a perpetual, claustrophobic twilight. Cora awoke in her wooden rocking chair by the hearth, her neck stiff and her back aching. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. Across the room, Jeremiah Hayes was awake, sitting perfectly still on a small wooden stool near the bed, watching over the feverish Thomas. The mountain man hadn't slept a wink. Cora quietly added a few logs to the fire, the crackle breaking the heavy silence. She filled the coffee pot with melted snow and a pitiful scoop of old, bitter grounds, setting it on the iron grate. "Fever hasn't broken," Jeremiah said softly, his voice a low rumble. He was rambling in the night, talking out of his head. "What was he saying?" Cora asked, bringing 2 tin cups of the dark, weak coffee to the small table. Jeremiah stood, his massive frame casting a long, dancing shadow across the rough-hewn floorboards. He took a cup, his knuckles white. Nothing that made a lick of sense, just fever dreams, nonsense about ledgers and bank vaults. Cora took a sip of her coffee, letting the bitter heat warm her chest. She walked over to the bed to check on her involuntary patient. Thomas's face was flushed, a dangerous crimson, sweat beading on his forehead despite the drafty chill of the cabin. As she leaned down to wipe his brow with a damp cloth, Thomas suddenly convulsed. His eyes flew open, glassy, unseeing, and wild with terror. He grabbed Cora's wrist with surprising strength, his fingers digging into her skin like iron talons. "Don't let them," Thomas rasped, his voice a wet, ragged wheeze. "The money in the saddlebags." "Blackwood," he lied. "Blackwood killed the sheriff." Cora froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She tried to pull her wrist away, but the delirious man held on tight. "Hush now, Tommy." Jeremiah stepped forward quickly, his large hand gently but firmly peeling Thomas's fingers off Cora's arm. He pressed the sick man back into the mattress. "You're safe. Rest," Thomas thrashed, his eyes darting blindly around the dim room. "No. The deputy. He shot me. He shot me in the back." With a final, exhausting gasp, Thomas's eyes rolled back, and he slumped into a deep, feverish unconsciousness once more. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of unsaid things. Cora backed away from the bed, her eyes darting to Jeremiah. The mountain man's face was an unreadable mask of stoic calm, but his jaw was clenched, so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "He said he was shot," Cora whispered, the realization hitting her like a bucket of icy water. "He said a deputy shot him in the back." Jeremiah didn't look at her. He busied himself adjusting the blankets over Thomas. "I told you, Miss Miller. He's out of his mind with fever." He took a nasty blow to the head from a falling tree branch. "It's making him hallucinate." Cora's gaze drifted to Thomas's discarded clothing piled near the corner of the room. She walked over to the blood-soaked silk waistcoat and the ruined wool coat. "What are you doing?" Jeremiah asked, a sudden edge of warning in his voice. "You said a branch caught him in the side of the head and shoulder," Cora said, her hands trembling as she lifted the heavy wool coat. She turned the garment over. Right in the center of the back, between the shoulder blades, the thick fabric was pierced by a perfectly round, burned hole. The edges of the wool were charred black, indicating a shot fired from relatively close range. She dropped the coat and spun around to face Jeremiah, her eyes wide with betrayal and fear. "That's a bullet hole. A falling pine branch doesn't leave powder burns, Mr. Hayes." Jeremiah let out a long, heavy sigh, the sound weary and laden with regret. He slowly lowered himself back onto the wooden stool, resting his elbows on his knees. The intimidating aura of the wild mountain man seemed to fracture, revealing something much more complicated underneath. "I didn't want to bring trouble to your doorstep, Cora," he said quietly, looking at his large, scarred hands. "I truly didn't, but if I hadn't lied to you last night, you wouldn't have let us in, and he would be dead." "Who is he?" Cora demanded, taking a cautious step toward the corner where her Winchester rifle was resting. "And who are you? Because I know you aren't just some mountain guide." Jeremiah watched her move toward the gun, but he made no effort to stop her. "His name really is Thomas. Thomas Sterling. He's the son of Arthur Sterling, the chief clerk at the First National Bank in Denver. Cora stopped. The sterling name was well known, even out in the remote valley.
This story was
They were
posted on the
wealthy,
channel The Rusty
influential
Saddle.
people.
Please do
Why
not
is a
repost
banker's
it in any
son riding
form.
through the San Juans in November? And why is he getting shot at by deputies? Because the deputy wasn't a real deputy, Jeremiah explained, his ice blue eyes locking onto hers. 3 days ago, a gang of outlaws hit a stagecoach transporting payroll outside of Durango. The gang was led by a man named Elias Blackwood. They killed the guards, stole $30,000 in gold certificates, and kidnapped Thomas for ransom. Cora's breath hitched. She had heard rumors of the Blackwood gang ruthless killers who operated in the high passes, bribing local law enforcement to turn a blind eye. I make my living trapping and hunting the high ridges, Jeremiah continued, his voice steady. I came across Blackwood's camp 2 nights ago. I saw the boy tied up, looking half dead. I couldn't just walk away. So you rescued him? Cora asked, her skepticism battling with the undeniable sincerity in his eyes. I caused a distraction, cut him loose, and threw him on a horse, Jeremiah said. But Blackwood's men gave chase. One of them put a bullet in Thomas's back before we could lose them in the timber. We've been riding blind through the storm ever since, trying to stay ahead of them. Cora looked at the massive man, absorbing his story. It made sense of the bullet hole, the fever dreams, and the desperate flight. But there was still something missing. As Jeremiah shifted on his stool, his heavy fur coat fell open slightly. Pinned to the inside pocket of his worn vest was a flash of tarnished silver. Cora squinted in the dim light. It wasn't a pocket watch. It was a star. A jagged, distinctively shaped silver star with the word Marshall faintly engraved across it. "You're not a trapper," Cora breathed, her eyes widening as the pieces fell into place. "I've heard stories about a man who vanished into the mountains years ago, a federal marshal who hunted down the men who murdered his wife and then never came back to civilized society. They call him the Grizzly of the San Juans." Jeremiah looked down at the silver star hidden inside his coat. He gently traced the cold metal with a scarred thumb, a profound sadness clouding his features. "I haven't worn this badge in the light of day for 5 years, Miss Miller," Jeremiah said, his voice thick with a sorrow that matched the howling wind outside. "I am a mountain man now. The marshal died a long time ago." Before Cora could respond, a new sound cut through the noise of the blizzard. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a falling branch. It was the distinct, sharp sound of a horse whinnying in distress, coming from directly outside her front window. Jeremiah stood up instantly, his demeanor changing in a heartbeat from a weary, heartbroken man to a deadly predator. In one fluid motion, he drew the massive Colt revolver from his hip. "Get away from the windows," Jeremiah whispered fiercely, stepping in front of Cora. "Blackwood found us." The wind howled a deafening counterpoint to the sudden, terrifying reality outside the cabin walls. Cora's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. She instinctively lunged for the Winchester, leaning against the table, her hands wrapping around the cold, familiar wood of the stock. Jeremiah Hayes did not panic. The colossal mountain man, who moments ago had seemed burdened by the heavy ghosts of his past, transformed instantly into a weapon forged of ice and iron. He moved with a terrifying, silent grace, stepping to the side of the heavy oak door and pressing his back against the rough-hewn logs. His massive Colt Peacemaker was drawn, the hammer already pulled back with a sharp, metallic click that cut through the tension in the room. "Get down, Cora," Jeremiah ordered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, authoritative whisper. Behind the iron stove. "Keep your head lower than the windowsills." Cora didn't argue. She scrambled across the floorboards, her coarse woolen skirt catching on splinters, and pressed herself against the cold cast iron of the cooking stove. She leveled the barrel of her rifle toward the front door, her hands trembling so violently the sights danced in the dim light of the dying hearth. Outside, a voice boomed over the roaring blizzard. It was a harsh, ragged sound, completely devoid of the desperate plea Jeremiah had used earlier that night. "Hayes, we know you're in there," the voice shouted. "And we know you got the Sterling boy. Send him out, and we'll let the homesteader live. Keep him inside. And we'll burn this shack down with both of you in it." Cora looked at Jeremiah. His jaw was locked tight, his icy blue eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door. "That's Elias Blackwood," Jeremiah muttered, confirming her worst fear. "He's got at least 3 men with him. They tracked the blood from Thomas's wound before the snow could cover it." "They can't burn the cabin in a whiteout," Cora whispered back, trying to inject some logic into the paralyzing fear. "The wood is too wet. The snow will drown the flames." "They don't need to burn it to the ground, Cora," Jeremiah replied grimly. "They just need to smoke us out, or shoot us through the walls." As if on cue, the night erupted. A volley of gunfire shattered the momentary standoff. Heavy lead slugs from a Sharps buffalo rifle tore through the front wall of the cabin like it was made of paper. Wood splintered violently, showering the interior with lethal, jagged fragments. One bullet completely obliterated the small ceramic coffee pot resting on the table, sending a spray of lukewarm water and bitter grounds across the floor. Cora screamed, burying her face against her knees as a second volley followed. The noise in the confined space was deafening, a physical pressure that boxed her ears and rattled her teeth. Jeremiah didn't flinch. He waited for a microscopic pause in the shooting, the inevitable moment when the outlaws had to work the levers of their rifles. In that breath of silence, the former marshal spun toward the front window. With a brutal kick, he shattered the remaining glass and the wooden crosspanes. He thrust his Colt through the opening and fired 3 times in rapid succession into the blinding white maelstrom. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the darkness, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the snowdrifts. "That's one," Jeremiah grunted, ducking back behind the solid logs as answering fire chewed up the window frame where his head had just been. "I'm not going to die cowering on the floor," Cora yelled over the ringing in her ears. She forced herself to a kneeling position, resting the heavy barrel of her Winchester on the edge of the iron stove for stability. Her father had taught her to shoot coyotes that menaced their meager chicken coop. A man trying to kill her was simply a larger, more vicious predator. A shadow darted past the shattered window, a dark silhouette against the swirling snow attempting to flank the cabin. Cora didn't hesitate. She sighted the shadow, pulled the trigger, and worked the lever, firing twice. The Winchester roared, kicking hard against her bruised shoulder. The shadow stumbled, cursing loudly, and scrambled back toward the cover of the tree line. Jeremiah threw her a look of genuine surprise, a fleeting grin breaking through his hardened facade. "Good shooting, Miss Miller. Keep them pinned if they try to cross the clearing." For the next 20 minutes, it was a terrifying game of attrition. The outlaws fired blindly into the cabin, relying on the sheer volume of lead to find a target. Jeremiah fired sparingly, only taking shots when he saw the muzzle flashes in the storm. The bitter, freezing wind howled through the shattered window, rapidly dropping the temperature inside the cabin to a deadly chill. The hearth fire was nothing more than a few sputtering embers. Then, suddenly, the gunfire ceased. The only sound was the relentless shrieking of the blizzard. Jeremiah held up a hand, signaling Cora to remain perfectly still. He listened intently, his head cocked toward the door. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. "They're falling back," Jeremiah finally whispered, slowly lowering his revolver. "The cold is getting to them. Their rifle mechanisms are freezing up, and they can't feel their trigger fingers. They'll retreat to the timberline to build a fire and wait us out till dawn." Cora slumped against the stove, the adrenaline rapidly draining from her system, leaving her utterly exhausted and freezing. She looked around her ruined home. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The cold was absolute. A low groan emanated from the bed. In the chaos of the gunfight, Cora had entirely forgotten about Thomas Sterling. The banker's sun was shifting weakly beneath the firs, his eyes fluttering open. The fever seemed to have broken, leaving him pale and incredibly weak, but finally lucid. "Water," Thomas
This story
croaked,
was posted
his
on the
voice
channel The
barely a
Rusty
whisper.
Saddle. Please
Cora
do not
scrambled
repost
up,
it in any
fetching
form.
a tin cup of clean snow melt from a bucket near the door, keeping low to the ground. She hurried to his side, lifting his head so he could drink. Thomas swallowed greedily, then fell back against the mattress, his eyes focusing on the bullet-riddled ceiling, and then on the towering figure of Jeremiah approaching the bed. "Marshall," Thomas rasped, recognizing his savior. "They found us." "They did, son," Jeremiah said, kneeling beside the bed. "But they're chewing on snow right now. You need to tell me exactly what Elias Blackwood wants with you. $30,000 in stagecoach gold is a hefty haul, but it ain't enough to keep men out in a blizzard like this. They're hunting you with a purpose." Thomas coughed, wincing as the pain in his shoulder flared. He looked past Jeremiah, his gaze landing on Cora. "Where are we?" "You're at my claim," Cora answered softly. "At the base of the Shenandoah Dives Ridge. I'm Cora Miller." At the mention of her name, Thomas's eyes widened in profound shock. He tried to sit up, a sudden, desperate energy filling his weakened frame. But Jeremiah firmly pushed him back down. "Miller?" Thomas gasped, staring at her as if he had seen a ghost. "Josiah Miller's daughter?" Cora stiffened, a cold dread washing over her that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Yes. My father was Josiah. How do you know that name?" Thomas closed his eyes, letting out a ragged breath. "Because of the ledger. Blackwood didn't kidnap me for ransom, Marshall. He kidnapped me because I found the private ledger in the bank vault, the one tying him to the Denver and Rio Grande Railway, and to Harlan Pratt." The name hung in the freezing air like a curse. Harlan Pratt, the wealthiest land speculator in the county, and the very man who had been relentlessly trying to seize Cora's property since the day her father was buried. Jeremiah's brow furrowed, his massive hand resting instinctively on the butt of his revolver. "Pratt? The cattle baron? What does a wealthy man like him have to do with a cutthroat like Blackwood?" "Everything," Thomas wheezed, shivering as the freezing air whipped through the shattered window. Cora quickly grabbed her thickest woolen quilt and draped it over him, tucking the edges tightly around his uninjured side. "Pratt isn't just buying up cattle ranges," Thomas explained, his voice growing stronger as he forced the words out. "My father is the chief clerk at the bank, but Pratt essentially owns the board of directors. A month ago, I was tasked with auditing the private lockboxes. I found a hidden ledger belonging to Pratt. It contained geological surveys from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency." Cora sat on the edge of her wooden rocking chair, leaning in closely. "Surveys of what?" "Your land, Miss Miller," Thomas said, his gaze locking with hers. The Shenandoah Dives mine wasn't drying up. The main vein simply shifted. It runs deep beneath the ridge, directly under your property line. It's one of the richest silver deposits ever charted in the territory. Cora felt the breath leave her lungs. "Under my cabin? But my father dug for years. He never found anything but granite and dust. Because he didn't have the heavy machinery to drill deep enough," Thomas replied. "Pratt knew the silver was there. He tried to buy the land from your father, didn't he?" "Yes," Cora whispered, the memories flooding back. "The constant visits, the thinly veiled threats. My father refused. He said this land was our home. 2 weeks later, the timber supports in the Shenandoah mine gave way while he was doing contract work. The cave-in crushed him. It wasn't an accident, Miss Miller," Thomas said softly, his eyes filled with pity. "The ledger detailed payments made by Pratt to Elias Blackwood. Blackwood and his gang act as Pratt's private muscle. They orchestrate stagecoach robberies to launder Pratt's money, and they handle his obstacles, like your father." Tears pricked Cora's eyes, hot and angry. The grief she had carried for 2 years suddenly twisted into a sharp, violent rage. Her father hadn't died due to the harsh luck of the frontier. He had been murdered for the dirt beneath his boots. When Pratt found out I had seen the ledger, he panicked, Thomas continued, coughing into a blood-stained rag. I tried to take the ledger to a federal judge in Denver, but Pratt's men intercepted my stagecoach. Blackwood took the book, killed the guards, and took me out into the mountains to execute me quietly, where no one would ever find the body. That's when the marshal intervened. Jeremiah stood up, pacing the small, freezing room like a caged grizzly. So, Blackwood isn't out there right now just to finish you off. He's out there to secure the property for Pratt. By killing Cora, if you both die in a blizzard, or at the hands of wandering outlaws, Thomas said grimly, the land defaults to the county for unpaid taxes. Pratt buys it at auction for pennies, and he becomes the richest man in Colorado. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The reality of their situation was bleak. They were trapped in a wooden box, surrounded by professional killers, with a blizzard raging outside and the temperature dropping to fatal levels. Cora walked over to the shattered window. Jeremiah had stuffed a heavy bear pelt into the frame to block the wind, but frost was already creeping up the interior logs. She felt a large, warm presence step up behind her. You're bleeding, Jeremiah said, his voice entirely devoid of its earlier harshness. Cora reached up and touched her cheek. When the coffee pot had exploded during the gunfight, a shard of ceramic had grazed her face. Her fingers came away stained with a mixture of dried and fresh blood. She hadn't even felt it. Jeremiah reached into his pocket and produced a clean, white cotton handkerchief. He gently took her chin in his massive, calloused hand, tilting her face toward the dim light of the lantern he had managed to relight. With surprising tenderness, he dabbed the blood from her cheek. His touch sent an unexpected jolt through her chest. Up close, she could see the silver in his thick beard and the deep, sorrowful lines etched around his eyes. He was a man who had seen the absolute worst of the world, a man who had retreated into the wilderness to escape the cruelty of men. Yet, here he was, standing between her and a bullet. I'm sorry I brought this to your door, Cora, Jeremiah murmured, his thumb brushing against her uninjured cheek. I thought I was just saving a foolish boy. I didn't know I was walking into a war. It's not your fault, Jeremiah, Cora said softly, using his given name for the first time. She looked up into his icy blue eyes, finding a comforting warmth there that belied their color. Pratt would have sent Blackwood for me eventually. You just forced his hand. At least now I know the truth about my father. Jeremiah studied her face, clearly moved by her resilience. Most women and most men, for that matter, would have surrendered by now. You're made of stronger stuff than pine and mud, Miss Miller. I have to be, she replied, stepping back slightly, acutely aware of the dangerous flutter in her stomach. This was not the time for romantic notions. They had to survive the night. We can't stay here, Cora said, her tone hardening as she looked at the heavily barred door. We're out of wood. The cold will kill Thomas by morning, and it will likely kill us, too. Even if it doesn't, Blackwood will return at first light with kerosene to burn us out. We can't outrun them in 3 feet of snow, Jeremiah pointed out, checking the cylinder of his Colt. My horse is dead shot out from under me during the chase. We are on foot. There is an old mining tunnel, Cora said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with a desperate idea. About a 1/4 mile up the ridge behind the cabin. My father dug it before he realized the vein ran deep. It's shored up with heavy timber and goes about 50 yards into the granite. It's a dead end, but it's sheltered from the wind. And there's a stash of blasting powder my father left behind. Jeremiah paused, his tactical mind immediately assessing the plan. A choke point. If we can get Thomas up there, we have the high ground. The rocks will provide cover from their rifles, and if they try to follow us into the tunnel, we light the powder, Cora finished, a fierce, vengeful light in her brown eyes. Jeremiah looked at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his bearded face. The grizzly of the San Juans had found a partner with claws of her own. Get your coat, Cora. We're going for a walk in the snow. The blizzard had transformed the rugged Colorado landscape into a blinding, featureless ocean of white. The temperature had
This story was
plummeted to a
posted on the channel
bone-snapping
The
20
Rusty
degrees
Saddle.
below
Please
zero,
do not
a
repost
deep
it in any
freeze
form.
that could turn a man's extremities black within the hour. Cora Miller wrapped herself in every layer of wool she owned, tying a heavy knit scarf around her face until only her dark, determined eyes were visible. Jeremiah Hayes, the grizzled former marshal, moved with the grim efficiency of a man who had survived the worst the frontier had to offer. He hoisted the feverish and fading Thomas Sterling onto his massive shoulders, treating the injured banker's son as though he weighed no more than a sack of dry flour. Thomas groaned, his head lolling against the thick, grisly furs of Jeremiah's coat, but he remained conscious enough to cling to the mountain man's collar. "We go out the back window," Jeremiah instructed, his voice a low rumble beneath the howling wind. "The snowdrift reaches the sill. It'll muffle our exit. Step exactly in my footprints, Cora. If we break a fresh trail side by side, Blackwood will spot it the second the sun breaches the peaks." Cora nodded, her hands gripping the cold, oiled steel of her Winchester rifle. She took one last look around her father's cabin, the only home she had known since they journeyed from Missouri. The bullet-riddled walls and the dead hearth were a grim testament to the violence brought upon her, but she felt no sorrow leaving it behind. The true value of the land was buried deep in the granite, and she was no longer willing to die for Harlan Pratt's greed. Jeremiah kicked the remaining wooden cross panes from the rear window, the glass already shattered from the crossfire. He hauled himself and Thomas through the opening, plunging waist-deep into the frozen powder. Cora followed immediately, the biting cold seizing her lungs like a vice the moment she left the meager shelter of the cabin. The trek up the Shenandoah Dives Ridge was a grueling, agonizing test of endurance. The incline was brutal, the jagged rocks hidden beneath treacherous drifts of snow. Jeremiah carved the path, using his massive frame as a snowplow, his thick boots punching deep holes into the white canvas. "Komesizu," Cora followed closely, placing her worn leather boots exactly where his had been, her legs burning with lactic acid and exhaustion. The wind screamed through the bare branches of the lodgepole pines, a demonic wail that masked the sound of their desperate flight. Every shadow looked like a crouching outlaw. Every snapping branch sounded like the crack of a Sharps buffalo rifle. "Keep moving," Jeremiah urged, his breath pluming like smoke from a locomotive. "We're losing the cover of the storm." It was true. The aggressive fury of the blizzard was beginning to taper off, the heavy snowfall thinning to a light, swirling powder. To the east, over the jagged teeth of the peaks near Howardsville, a faint, bruised purple light signaled the approaching dawn. After what felt like a lifetime of agonizing climbing, they reached a narrow, treacherous switchback hugging the side of the cliff. There, hidden behind a copse of dead, lightning-struck spruces, was the gaping, black maw of the old mining tunnel. "We made it," Cora gasped, her voice raw and hoarse. Jeremiah ducked beneath the heavy timber supports that Josiah Miller had painstakingly installed years ago. The air inside the tunnel was instantly still, free from the murderous wind, though it was as cold as a meat locker. The heavy scent of damp earth, pulverized granite, and ancient pine filled the dark space. Jeremiah carefully lowered Thomas to the rocky floor, leaning the exhausted man against the cavern wall. Thomas was shivering violently, his lips tinged a dangerous shade of blue. "We can't light a fire," Jeremiah muttered, unbuckling his heavy grizzly fur coat. He draped the massive, warm hide over Thomas and Cora both, forcing them to huddle together against the rock. "Smoke will drift out the entrance. Blackwood will smell it before he sees it." Cora huddled under the heavy fur, the lingering warmth of Jeremiah's body radiating from the leather. She looked up at the towering mountain man, who now stood in the freezing dampness, wearing only his flannel shirt and vest. "You'll freeze to death, Jeremiah," Cora whispered, a deep pang of worry striking her heart. Jeremiah knelt beside her, his face inches from hers in the dim, pre-dawn gloom of the cave. He reached out, his bare, calloused hand brushing a stray lock of dark hair from her frozen cheek. The touch was startlingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. "I've survived worse winters than this, Cora," he said softly, his icy blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When you've spent 5 years hunting the ghosts of the men who took your family, the cold stops bothering you. The ice just settles in your veins." "Your wife," Cora realized softly, remembering the rumors of the grizzly of the San Juans. "That's why you left the Marshalls." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, a flash of ancient pain crossing his rugged features. "Her name was Sarah. A gang of rustlers hit our homestead while I was riding a circuit in the Animas Valley. When I found the men who did it, I didn't arrest them. I buried them. And I left the badge pinned to a tree. I thought I was done with the world of men, Cora. Until tonight. Until you opened that door." Cora reached out from beneath the fur, her small, cold hand resting against his broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. "You aren't a ghost, Jeremiah Hayes. You're the most alive man I've ever met." A heavy, charged silence stretched between them, thick with an undeniable, magnetic pull. But the moment was abruptly shattered by a sound echoing from the mountain below. It was the distinct, sharp crunch of heavy boots breaking through the frozen crust of the snow. Jeremiah stood up instantly, the tender mountain man vanishing, replaced once more by the lethal lawman. He drew his Colt, spinning the cylinder with a deadly click. "They found the trail," Jeremiah said grimly. "Cora, where is the blasting powder?" Cora scrambled out from under the firs, grabbing her Winchester. She moved deeper into the tunnel, her hands feeling along the rough granite walls, until her fingers brushed against a stack of wooden crates covered in a heavy canvas tarp. "Here," she called out, dragging the heavy canvas back. Beneath it sat 3 wooden kegs, stenciled with the words DuPont Black Powder. Beside them lay a coil of fuse and a tin of sulfur matches. Jeremiah moved quickly, rolling 2 of the heavy kegs toward the entrance of the tunnel. He positioned them precisely behind a natural outcropping of rock, creating a lethal bottleneck. He unspooled the fuse, running it back 10 yards into the darkness where Cora and Thomas took cover. "When they step into the mouth of the tunnel," Jeremiah instructed, his eyes fixed on the entrance where the pale morning light was beginning to spill in, "we light it, but we have to draw them in close. If we blow it too soon, the rockfall won't trap them." The morning sun finally crested the San Juan peaks, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the snow-covered world. Inside the tunnel, however, the shadows remained deep and absolute. "Hayes." Elias Blackwood's voice echoed off the granite walls, laced with a cruel, triumphant sneer. "You led us on a hell of a hike. I'll give you that. But it's a dead end. Come on out and hand over the Sterling boy, and I'll give the homesteader girl a quick death." Jeremiah stood pressed against the wall near the entrance, completely hidden from the outside. He didn't answer. He simply waited, his breathing slow and controlled. 3 figures appeared in the mouth of the tunnel, silhouetted against the glaring white snow. Elias Blackwood stood in the center, a tall, vicious-looking man wearing a heavy buffalo coat and holding a lever-action rifle. Flanking him were 2 hardened outlaws, their revolvers drawn. "I know you're in there, Marshal," Blackwood sneered, stepping cautiously into the gloom. "Pratt pays me far too much to let you walk away with that ledger." The girl's father was a stubborn fool, and he paid the price. Don't make the same mistake. At the mention of her father, Cora's finger tightened on the trigger of her Winchester. She knelt beside the fuse, the tin of matches open in her trembling hand. "You talk too much, Blackwood." Jeremiah's voice boomed from the shadows, echoing confusingly off the cavern walls. Blackwood raised his rifle, squinting into the darkness. "Fire into the pitch," he ordered his men. Before the outlaws could pull their triggers, Jeremiah stepped out from behind the timber support. His massive Colt Peacemaker roared, a blinding flash of fire in the dark. The outlaw to Blackwood's right took a .45 caliber slug directly to the chest, thrown backward into the snowbank with a wet thud. Blackwood and the remaining man fired blindly, the deafening cracks of their weapons filling the confined space. Rock splinters rained down as bullets chipped the granite walls inches from Jeremiah's head. "Cora, now!" Jeremiah shouted, diving behind a heavy wooden support beam. Cora struck the sulfur match against the rock. It flared to life, casting a harsh yellow glow over her determined face. She touched the flame to the tip of the powder fuse. It caught instantly, hissing and spitting a trail of angry white sparks as it burned rapidly toward the kegs at the entrance. "Powder!" The remaining outlaw screamed, spotting the sparking fuse winding across the rocky floor. Blackwood's eyes widened in sheer terror. He dropped his rifle and turned to run back out into the snow. "Get down!" Jeremiah roared.
This story was
throwing his
posted on the
massive body
channel
over
The Rusty
Cora and
Saddle.
Thomas,
Please do not
shielding them
repost
beneath
it
his
in any
weight
form.
and the heavy grizzly coat. The explosion was apocalyptic. The DuPont black powder detonated with a concussive force that felt like the mountain itself had been torn asunder. A massive fireball erupted at the mouth of the tunnel, vaporizing the heavy timber supports. The sound was a physical blow, temporarily deafening everyone inside. The roof of the tunnel entrance groaned, a terrible, grinding sound of shifting tectonic weight. With a thunderous crash, tons of solid granite, snow, and earth collapsed downward, sealing the entrance completely and burying Elias Blackwood and his remaining man beneath an inescapable tomb of stone. A thick, choking cloud of dust and pulverized rock swept over them. For several agonizing minutes, there was nothing but darkness and the ringing in their ears. Slowly, Jeremiah pushed himself up, coughing violently as he waved the thick dust away. "Cora? Thomas? We're alive," Cora choked out, sitting up and feeling for her limbs. Miraculously, they were unhurt, though covered in a thick layer of gray powder. A narrow shaft of morning sunlight pierced through a small gap near the top of the collapsed rocks, illuminating the settling dust. The entrance was destroyed, but they weren't entirely trapped. It would take hours of digging, but they could move enough loose stone to squeeze through. Jeremiah looked down at Cora, his face covered in soot and dirt, his chest heaving. He reached down, offering her his massive hand. Cora took it, and he pulled her effortlessly to her feet. "The ledger is safe," Thomas whispered weakly from the floor, clutching his coat where the damning book was hidden. "Pratt is finished." Jeremiah didn't let go of Cora's hand. He stepped closer, the adrenaline of the fight slowly ebbing away, leaving only the profound, undeniable connection that had been forged in the crucible of the freezing night. "I reckon my time hiding in the high country is over," Jeremiah said quietly, his thumb tracing the knuckles of her dirty hand. "If you're heading to Denver to see this through, Miss Miller, you might need a marshal to ensure you get there." Cora looked up into his eyes, a fierce, beautiful smile breaking through the dirt and exhaustion on her face. The wild mountain man had descended from his solitary peak, and in the ruins of her old life, she had found something entirely new. "I'd like that, Jeremiah," she replied softly. "I'd like that very much." The destruction of Elias Blackwood at the Shenandoah Dives Ridge marked the explosive end of Harlan Pratt's tyrannical reign over the Colorado Territory. Weeks later, accompanied by the formidable former Marshal Jeremiah Hayes, Cora Miller, and Thomas Sterling delivered the blood-stained ledger directly to Governor John L. Rout in Denver. The irrefutable proof of bribery, land theft, and the murder of Josiah Miller led to Pratt's immediate arrest and the dismantling of his corrupt empire. Cora retained her land, leasing the rich silver rights to a reputable firm, transforming the poor homesteader into a woman of immense independence and wealth. Yet, her greatest treasure was not pulled from the granite. Jeremiah Hayes never returned to his solitary exile. The man who had arrived as a terrifying ghost of the mountains remained by Cora's side, proving that even the coldest, most shattered hearts could be thawed by the fierce, enduring fire of true love.